Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi Hanna, the Executive Director for the American Institute of Stress, and your host for Stress Talk Live, a new series I'm going to be presenting where I have conversations with people about topics related to stress management, resilient energy management, and really how to think about stress in a more productive way, where we can use stress as a stimulus for growth and collaboration, as opposed to something that might break us down or burn us out over time. I'm delighted to bring you my first interview with Dr. Robert Brooks of Harvard. He is an amazing psychologist and just a brilliant, warm-hearted man. And we had a long conversation talking about how to cope with the stress of the current environment, having just gone through a somewhat challenging election season. Regardless of what side of the political fence you're on, there are a lot of people dealing with trauma or even just exhaustion from the process that we've all gone through. So we talked a little bit about that, as well as some specific strategies to help build resilience in children, which happens to be an area of expertise for Dr. Brooks. So I hope you will enjoy this episode of Stress Talk Live. Personally, I would just love to hear a little bit more about your journey, what got you into this, and what you're doing now.
I wasn't sure if you wanted me to start when I was a kid or what. I can
Anything
start.
you feel is relevant works for me.
Okay, well, I'll start more professionally because my main interest over the past several decades has been on the theme of resilience, what helps people to bounce back from adversity and deal with stress more effectively. And when I was first trained as a psychologist, we still had what we call the deficit model. So most of my work focused on, what is wrong with this patient, whether child or adult, and how do I, quotes, fix it? And there were several experiences along the way which were very helpful to me to start realizing that I would never touch another person's heart or soul if I ignored or neglected what their strengths were. One was working in the inner city of Boston. I started to wonder how people grew up under racism and poverty and yet, really rose above that and remained so optimistic and hopeful. And a lot of my career was spent working at a psychiatric hospital, McLean Hospital, which is the psychiatric teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School. And that's where I really became very interested in looking at, especially running a locked door inpatient unit for children and adolescents, what would help people, these kids who are having so many difficulties, to bounce back. And so there was a time I finally said, Bob, I think you've really spent so much time focusing on what's wrong with people. Maybe you have to start asking the question, what is it that helps people to really be resilient? What helps people to lead more purposeful lives? And so I can't believe, like 35 years ago or so, I started much more to focus on strengths, or what I eventually called, each person has islands of competence or areas of strength, and can we build upon them? And I found it changed my whole interviewing style. When I would meet with parents about their children, initially, years before, I would spend the whole hour or next hour talking about their child's problems. And then after 10, 15 minutes, as I changed my own style, I would ask them, could you please tell me what you see as your child's strengths, their beauty, their islands of competence? And it was amazing, Heidi, how the whole tenor of the meeting started to change. So when I would consult with teachers about students who are having difficulty, the same thing. After a few minutes, what do you see as the student's strengths? And with my adult patients, the same thing. I would start asking them about moments in their life when they felt stronger. What were their passions? What were their interests? And for me, it became just a very fascinating experience of how just a change in certain questions led to what I would say a much broader, for me, much more enjoyable and productive career. And so as that progressed, more and more of my work focused on the whole issue of how do we live resilient lifestyles, how from birth do we help children be resilient, and having worked with a lot of what I'll quote, put in quotes, at-risk populations, How do we help people to, really overcome the adversities they face? And just one other point, initially the work on resilience focused on, looking at kids who would overcome great adversity and were doing, rather nicely now as adults, decent jobs, good relations. But what I realized is what we learned from at-risk populations, we could apply to all people, because none of us knows at what point in our life we may face more challenges than at other points in our life.
That's so, I have to say that is so beautiful and refreshing.
Mm.
And, having met you for such a short period of time, I think there's a quick connection that you feel with people when you can tell you're just vibing at this in the same space and kind of looking at things from that same lens. And what you were talking about reminds me so much of the work that's being done around, for so long we focus on PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder, but then there's a lot of work looking at post-traumatic stress growth and the fact that people can use those experiences. And some of my favorite research looking at lottery winners who actually are suffering more after they win the lottery, and then amputees who have this beautiful new framework. I do some work with a group called Challenge Athletes Foundation, and the gentleman that was started after was actually traumatized twice. And I remember hearing an interview where he shared that his accident showed him that he was so much more than his physical presence. And there was just a light in him of this extraordinary resilience. It was really beautiful.
Well, let me just return the compliment. The moment I heard you speak at the conference in Boston, I said, wow, this is a woman who, everything you said and with the Usher family just resonated with my own beliefs. The other thing is something else you said. We're very poor at forecasting. There's a whole field of affective forecasting, how people think they're going to feel if they win the lottery, if certain things happen. And what it often shows is people are not as happy as they think around certain events. And people handle what they felt they couldn't handle much more effectively than they may realize. So we never know what's going to happen, in regards to that. And yeah, you do read about some of these lottery winners who do not handle I won't say their fame, their monies very well. It changes a lifestyle, but they're not able to cope with that lifestyle.
Well, and I think we're taught from such an early age, obviously, to strive for these goals. And
Mhm.
I know, professional athletes, having worked with them and looking at the fact that, everyone just kind of puts happiness as this outcome that we get to once we accomplish these goals. And essentially, you're still yourself when you get there. You still have to deal with the same stuff.
Right, and actually, some works like by Sean Aker really show the opposite. It's not that success leads to happiness; it's happiness leading to success. And I love one of his definitions of happiness: really positive emotions with a sense of purpose and meaning. And having done a lot of work also with schools, I always say to teachers, one of your first jobs is how do you create positive emotions in your classroom where every child feels he or she has a sense of purpose. And some of that goes back to research I did years ago when I asked people, when I was writing a book about school climate, what is one of your best memories of school when you were a child, something a teacher said or did that boosted your dignity and motivation? And the number one response I got from hundreds of these questionnaires was when you were asked to help out. Things like, I remember when a teacher asked me to pass out the milk and straw. I remember when a teacher asked me to tutor a younger child. And that's at any age, by the way. There's a lot of research when I was writing a book about resilience in adults through our senior years. There's a lot of research that shows that we're controlling for a whole number of factors, that when people are helping out in some way, they really lead more effective lives, both emotionally and physically.
Well, I will tell you, there's my brain's going in so many different directions. Sean is a good friend of mine.
Oh, is he?
I just met with him a week ago, and his beautiful wife and their amazing son, who I always call the happiest child on earth because he had two positive psychologists as parents. So we'll see how that works out. But knowing what his work is going into and what his next book is on, we got to connect you guys for sure, because it's a lot of the same stuff about what happens when we serve others. And I know from my own journey. I haven't shared this with you yet. Some of my audience is familiar with this, but I grew up with panic attacks from an early age and
Mhm.
struggled with really severe depression, and even fairly recently had a very probably one of my most challenging bouts with I call it anxiety induced depression, but whatever it is. And really, it was that moment of, even though I didn't know necessarily what tomorrow was going to bring, it was shifting to service and getting into a place where I was doing some, it's kind of silly to talk about, but doing homeless feeds in our community here, and it was so transformational. And I think logically we know that when we serve others, or Sean talks a lot, and Marty Seligman, about acts of service, and gratitude and appreciation. It's like, I think sometimes we get stuck logically knowing it, but then kind of getting trapped or getting hijacked a little bit by our own brain and our own internal dialogue that says, who are we, or what do we really have to offer, or fear. And I'm thinking about that so much with the current environment and what we're all experiencing collectively. I just read your beautiful article about the election, but just how much fear can hijack that internal narrator. And it just makes me wonder kind of your pulse on what is going on today. And I would say it's not just in our country. I have a lot of friends outside of the country sending me messages of fear and uncertainty. So I guess the question is either, how does that happen? What have we done to allow that to kind of hijack us? Or potentially, how do we come back from that? How do we heal? I know that's a really loaded question that could probably
No,
take the whole hour, but
no, well, we could spend probably 5 days, and just to get back to something you said, when you speak to Sean Akett, tell him he's had a huge impact on my work, and his work is mentioned in all of my presentations. I have slides on that. What you brought up, and what I tried to say in that article, and it was interesting. I had mentioned I was in Canada, the week before, giving a series of workshops, and I have a lot of Canadian relatives, and I cannot tell you, this was before the election, how many invited me to move
yeah.
here. But that's one way of looking at things. In that article, what I tried to say, and it's not always easy to follow, there's certain principles. And, as a clinical psychologist for so many years, seeing the whole age range, basically, and looking at what were some issues that led people to be more fearful and anxious. And I totally accept the fact that some people are more predisposed to that, but I also, in several of my books, I say what we have to start to realize, that there are a lot of factors that go into our lives, but in many ways, we are the authors of our own lives. And I try to say that whether we realize it or not, we may have more control over what goes on, not about events that happen, like the election, but how we respond to it. And, in that article I wrote about something I've written a great deal about, the whole notion, whatever you want to call it, I call it personal control, to really look at what are the things we can control. And it's been very helpful as I've worked with a number of kids who have learning problems or attentional problems. They had no control over having the learning or attentional problems. What I try to help them is, okay, with those problems, how do you cope with them? I've worked with adults who have faced, and it's obvious, honey, very open, faced certain issues in their life, and that some are not as easy to overcome. And I've tried to look at, okay, what can help you to overcome it? And I'm very realistic. The article before the last one, I talked about basically, can you have an optimistic outlook and still prepare for setbacks, which I believe you can. As a matter of fact, one of the things I started to say to patients, without wanting to have a self-fulfilling prophecy for failure, is as we worked out different strategies, changes in their life, I started bringing up, but what if this doesn't work? What's a backup plan? And I found for many of my patients, this was very helpful, because when I didn't do that, they would try something, it didn't work. They would fall to their old default and say, see, what good is it? And you brought up something very important. I've heard that, what difference could I make? And one of the things I try to say is, in other research I did, one comment you make to someone, one thing you do they will remember 30, 40 years from now. I saw that when I was another part of research I did when I was looking at school climate. I asked people their basically best memory of school, something a teacher said it did that boosted their dignity. And it was amazing that some of the people were 65, 70 years old. Some of the memories went back 55 years as they were telling it, because I had both questionnaire, but in my workshops, I would have people come up. As they were telling it, it was like it was yesterday. And so I say that to people, we must never underestimate that. And one of the things I try to do is have people, and my workshops even talk about someone who was very significant in their life. What did they say or do? It's for them to recognize, as I say in one book, the importance of the seemingly small gestures and the difference they make in anyone's life is very powerful. I mean, it's very reassuring for me that I could know that. I mean, just today you mentioned that article.
Yeah.
I've gotten a number of responses, only one negative.
I anticipate that.
Oh yeah, I'm used to it. He said you were just trying to, it was too political, and I loved his quote. He said, "So now it's going to spam." What can I do? Yeah. But most said, we don't know if you realized that this was very helpful to us. Yeah. Well, you always then feel, hey, maybe I'm making some difference, and it is very powerful. The problem is sometimes we get into such a state and we get so exhausted that we sometimes feel, what is it we could do? Both I mentioned that in the article, as a psychologist doing a lot of therapy, sometimes the things that go first are the very things that should not go, like exercise and one's diet. But I know that feeling when one gets exhausted, one just feels like there's nothing I can really do. And, we have to just try to look at those small steps we can take.
I so agree with that. And I was really glad to read that you even were feeling a little bit of the exhaustion from the advertisements. And I think we don't realize, and in fact, Sean and his wife, Michelle, did a study that showed that people that watch 3 minutes of negative news in the morning rate their day as negative 30% more likely. So it's shifting the lens through which you see the world around you. And I think that's a huge part of it. My perspective, even on stress, is that stress is essentially just a demand versus capacity issue. That anytime we don't have the capacity for the demand, there's a response to that, and it can build us up or it can break us down. But that you're absolutely right, that sometimes it's when we're experiencing stress that we don't sleep, or we miss meals, or we sit at our desk all day instead of getting out and experiencing fresh air. And we don't realize that those little nudges are communicating to the brain that we have what we need to deal with what feels like these big hurdles. And I think there's something to be said for just exhaustion. I actually think this last phase that I went through, which was almost 6 months, was actually literally burnout. I'm fascinated by this idea of kind of a chemical burnout that people can experience, of being on for so long and living at such a fast pace, and the world throwing so much at us all of the time.
Yeah, that's why, I'm smiling as I say this. I used to just get a little pleasure. I would watch a little of the news, but as I said in the article, I mainly watch sports, but I couldn't even watch the weather even.
Yeah.
Because what happened was between every break, I started disliking candidates I did not even know, local candidates. I didn't want to hear one more ad, so it can become very exhausting. But what you bring up is very important. What I always will say in my workshops and in my clinical work is we have to anticipate that that's going to come up. And a lot of the work also is when it comes up, what are the best ways you have managed to cope? And I still remember a woman I saw in therapy, and I'll make this a long story, but I'll make it very short, who, when she got depressed, I said, what do you do? And she said, I'm smiling to tell you this because you'll hear what happened. She said, well, I just, go to bed and put the cover over my head and whatever. And I said, well, we have to find something more active for you to do. So I said, we'll talk about that. So the next week she comes in. First of all, Heidi, she looked much better. She said, you know what? It sounded so simple what you said, but I found something more active to do. And I thought she was going to say she went jogging or anything. I said, well, I really cleaned my house. And she said, but I was feeling so down that I cleaned it twice. And she was some kid with, I said, look, next time clean it once, come to my house, we'll do it. And she laughed. But
Yeah.
it was the simplest thing that her default coping style was just go to bed
Yeah.
rather than I think people should exercise, but she was getting exercise
Yeah.
and she felt she was accomplishing something. So sometimes it's a matter also of helping people to think about what are ways of coping. Because I say all of us are going to get depressed, all of us are going to get anxious, and some people are just predisposed towards greater anxiety or depression. So that may happen. The key issue is, okay, what do you do when it happens? And what do you do even to minimize it happening?
Yeah.
And that gets to personal control, because when you feel you have ways of coping when things come up, you feel more in control rather than, oh, I'm feeling this again, I'm feeling this, but you're also feeling helpless. You don't know what to do. So I started seeing a lot of therapy was really helping people to develop those ways of coping that when things came up, they can handle. Plus, what you brought up is you and also grow from it and learn from it, which is also very important. The whole notion of post-traumatic growth, that you're not just going back to a certain level, you're really learning from this particular situation, is to me a very important aspect of the work that I know I do and we all do.
Yeah. Well, and I think, if anybody looks back at periods of time where they really grew a lot, there
Mm.
was some stress, some discomfort in that. And I know for me, anytime I've gone through those moments, I always look for the lesson. I can
Mhm.
always look back and see a lesson that was learned, but the quicker I can shift to listen, what I guess would be like a lesson mentality of
Right.
the lesson in this, the easier it is to go through it, because now it gives purpose. And I know you mentioned Viktor Frankl's book, which is, like on my countertop all the time as a reminder. That was life changing for me, that when we can put meaning to something, it makes the suffering worthwhile. And sometimes that suffering can actually just be a fuel or an energy. It's the shift that I try to do even with speaking, of going from panic or anxiety to energy.
Yeah.
Can
Well, you
flow
certainly
more
showed the
effectively.
energy when I saw you. I didn't see any anxiety there.
Oh my
I
God.
always had a little anxiety. If you recall, it ended up like I had 10 minutes instead of a half hour. And then the PowerPoint didn't work. But you see, I reframed it. I said, it's just as well the PowerPoint's not working because I couldn't go through all the slides anyway.
That's
So
right.
afterwards, I felt, just relax. You're not going to go through the slides anyway. You would have had to skip some.
And that's a resilient, what I believe in, we both teach, is that, through these experiences in your life, you build a resilient mindset. And essentially what it does is allow you to be adaptable in the moment. So same thing when I was getting up on stage, they didn't have the stools up and I had Beth and I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that. Didn't want them to feel uncomfortable. It was just this whirlwind. And I always laugh because I say, I can, if I put out to the world that I'm an expert on stress, then I should at least be able to do this. So it's kind of like, bring
That's
it on.
right. Yeah, it wouldn't look very good if we just. As a matter of fact, someone actually came up to me after that and said, "Was that set up for you to show how you deal with
Right, right.
unanticipated things?" I said, "No, but I was honest. I said, look, if that was my first talk, it might have been my last, But you get used to it, and you
Yeah,
talk a lot about humor also. You
yeah.
just you just have to go with it, and even when I don't know, I might have said, "Did you see the screen just go dark and everyone laughs?" Was it just me? So then all of then makes you feel comfortable because the energy in the room, people are now laughing, and you feel, hey, I know the main points I want to say. People are now in a more receptive mood to hearing it. So
Absolutely. So a side note, and then I'm going to come back to something. I was sitting with Beth Usher, and I turned to her as you were speaking, and I said, he's really funny. You need to invite him to our conference. And so don't be surprised if she starts stalking you to get you to come to our conference. We're
she
both.
wrote me she wrote me a very nice note. I didn't have a chance to meet her, but her
Yeah.
parents came up afterwards, and I had a chance to chat with them. Great people. You did a wonderful interview with them.
Thank you. So on that note, I have been very surprised at just how traumatized a lot of people have been by the election. And I think regardless of what side you're on, there's just a lot of uncertainty. And so, I guess one of my questions is, a very good friend of mine had said that she actually, and she's one of the most resilient people I know, was online searching for information on how to cope and was finding herself frustrated with all of these kind of quick fix things. And so I just wonder, is there a space to just encourage people to also feel what they feel and not push them too quickly into, okay, now we're going to heal and make good, but just appreciate that.
Oh, definitely. There's no quick fix. First of all, one of the reasons I called it uncertain times my article is this is going to continue. It is going to be very uncertain. It's going to be uncertain when a new president-elect takes office and for months after that. So that's one of the reasons it's not going to go down. And I think one of the difficulties, and sometimes we do it with kids, but we do it with adults as well, is, well, don't worry, whatever. Well, it would be like if you said to me, Beth, Bob, I've been feeling depressed. And I said, no reason for you to be. I mean, you'd say, I just told them I'm feeling depressed on that. What I say to people is, those feelings are your feelings, but then what we have to look at is, are there ways of managing them more when things are uncertain? Because things can be very uncertain about a lot of things. It could be personally in our life. Now we're talking about a whole country and the whole world based on the election results. So that's why it was interesting. A couple of things you said. One of the letters I got was from a woman who has a daughter in college who said, my daughter's heartbroken. But she said, your article was the first one that I felt less fear and more hope after reading it, because I think in part I validated that it's a fearful time, that it's a worrisome time, but that there are things we have to look at. And even that football player's quote that I mentioned, where he said, what I have control over is what I can teach my daughter. And what I have control over, and it starts with me, is how I behave and how, I act. So what I was really trying to say in that article, or, just my whole philosophy is, but this is a whole country we're talking about and world, is there are things that happen that we do not have as much control over that we would wish. And that's why we have to start looking about what are those things that will help us more. She mentioned, I had not even heard about this, a million woman walk or rally in Washington on the day of the inauguration. I had not even heard of it. She said she's going down with other women from her church. And, when I wrote her back after her lovely email, I said, well, those are the kinds of things that are very important, because she feels at least I can take some action. And it's interesting your question, because I said, your daughter has every right to be heartbroken. I think a lot of people are heartbroken, whatever word you want to use, and startled, surprised. I felt, anxious. And it's uncertain. But that's why I think even with those uncertain times, if we adopt a victim mentality, what could we do? Then it makes it worse. And when we have a victim mentality, it's very easy to see things in terms of we and they, and that. So that's where I felt, what are the connections? Because I even mentioned there are things you can do, but even there are things you can do as a group, so you have that connectedness again.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And that's so important. I remember I was so shocked when I first saw the research that showed that feeling isolated is as bad for your health as smoking cigarettes. And I used to talk about the Fab Four of brain health, that was, nutrition and exercise and stress management and sleep. And then I was like, wow, this social element and the books, Loneliness and all the work that's been done is really fascinating to pull us together, and yet at the same time be very aware and careful about the mob mentality that can happen of the we versus they, because I think our deep need to be part of a tribe can also in some ways be dangerous.
Yes. Well, what you bring up, anything could be taken to a negative or a positive. I've written much more about the positive. I know people found last week comfort in their, churches and temples and mosques. The connectedness there, and not the mob mentality, which I often find is just so, it's irrational, and it becomes a we-they kind of thing. I mean, this is a point where I really feel people have to come together more. That's why one of the examples I used, which I was almost in tears, was the family in New Hampshire, an African American family where things were dumped on their lawn, whatever, and the Manchester Motorcycle Club got together, and it was a wonderful TV on the TV news. One time I actually watched the news and it was happy. And you should see this 7-year-old boy. They went to his house. They gave him a helmet. They gave him a leather jacket. They took him out for yogurt. And the mother just saying, we were scared to go to bed. And now we feel we have these friends. That connection, that boy will never forget, nor will the mother. And as I said in my article, no one asked each other who they voted for.
Right.
It was people reaching out to people who were in need. And it was just a very powerful story. And you could see the couple of people they interviewed from the motorcycle club, they just felt something had to be done. And you could see they felt good about it. And, the boy with his motorcycle jacket and helmet, oh, wow.
Cool. So
yeah.
Cool. Well, and I know you've also written about 9/11, and I want to be careful not to make this an extreme comparison. But someone who grew up with a fear of flying and public speaking, who ended up doing and happened to be on a plane.
Yes,
on 9/11, when all of that happened, was definitely traumatic. And yet, I ended up actually getting stuck. I was living in Florida. I was speaking in Pittsburgh, got stuck in Chicago for a week. And I have to say that even with my negativity bias and my fear, there was so much obvious beauty and support and collaboration. I remember spending a lot of time in the bar of my hotel having conversations I probably never would have had, and seeing so much more of what we had in common, and people rallying together to get people back to where they needed to go safely. And so I think, when you go through those experiences and you're challenged in those ways and you change your lens so you see the beauty in it, very quickly this time, with the same surprise and kind of shock that a lot of people had, I just remember going kind of quickly to what an opportunity. We're going to have conversations we would not have had otherwise.
That's right.
In the darkest times, the light shines the brightest. So now's our opportunity to really go out and love people in extraordinary ways, and really have people take notice of that. So again, I don't want to minimize people's feelings. I want to appreciate that. But then I also want to encourage them that, now's the time to really deeply connect with your values, as you wrote about in your article. Who are you and what's important to you, and how do you want to serve from that place, this world that's really hungry for that right now?
Yes. It's what you brought up for me is very important. People have often said sometimes it's almost a pity that it takes an event like 9/11 to bring people so together. I remember, I happened to be home there, and I had also lost a brother in the Air Force to a terrorist attack. So when I just happened to be home putting on the news when the first plane had hit, they weren't even sure what happened. And his picture was up there, and, I just started to cry. It brings back many of your own memories. But it was interesting to me how everyone in our community all of a sudden wanted to have a little American flag there, or people were just nicer to each other. I wish we could somehow keep that going without necessarily having a tragedy like 9/11.
Yeah.
And, even what we were talking about before, I remember reading about one class in New York where the kids were feeling overwhelmed. So they had the kids make sandwiches for first responders and put a little American flag on it. Because one of the things I've learned, when you feel you have no control, we didn't have any control over 9/11.
Yeah.
You've got to find ways for people to feel they're making a difference. It helps them to be more active, but also gives purpose and meaning. We took getting back to that, to their lives. And it was very powerful. I wrote several articles about that. It's so interesting to me, Heidi, how many responses I got back, just little thank yous. Thank you for writing about this. Thank you for, some of your thoughts about this. And of course, then it makes you feel that you're handling the situation better as well. And I think a lot of us, it sounds like you truly grew from it. For someone who, gets stuck in, well, Chicago's a great city though.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Not the first hotel, but I ended up moving to another one that was much, much more comfortable.
Well, if you're going to be there, you might as well. But why I appreciate that, I was so glad I wasn't traveling at that day.
Yeah.
A few days later, I drove somewhere. I was going to New York, and at first I thought they were going to cancel. This was upstate New York, and they said, no, no, if anything, we need you more than ever. And so, I went, but I was glad for 2 or 3 days. I was home,
Yeah.
and that could be close to family. It was important. So I could imagine being on the road. If I was there, probably would have done the same thing, gone to the bar, met some people. And that's important. Those are connections.
Yeah.
It's that you're right. You talk to people normally we would not talk with. Uh, because of what had happened, and we all needed to reach out and feel, people were reaching out to us.
Yeah, it's that human element, and I think it's such a big part of being resilient and
Yeah.
embracing each day. And so, the other thing, and we'll probably start to wind down with this, that I know a lot of people are asking about is the kids. And so, this particular friend of mine who was really struggling, I appreciate that. I don't have kids of my own. And so, I always like to get feedback from other people around this, that her big concern was, how do I explain this? And so, I've seen comments about whether it's bullying or whatever. How do we, I know you've done so much amazing work on not building, nurturing, and you shifted my words on that, which I think is great. But how do we nurture?
That's what you use, build. Most people use build. I happen to like the word nurturing.
I do too, and so I'm very aware of that. It had an impact on me. But how do we nurture that in children?
Yeah. Well, one of the things is, and what reminds me of, after writing a couple of books on nurturing resilience in kids or raising resilient children, I can't tell you how many parents and teachers or other people who work with kids said, can you help kids be resilient if you're feeling stressed out all the time?
Oh,
And,
gosh.
the quick answer is it's much more difficult. So that's what led me to write a book about resilience in our adult lives, not just as parents, but just what helps us to be resilient. So the first thing is, and you said something like this before, one need not hide their feelings. But we really have to be careful. If we look totally overwhelmed, that's what scares kids even more.
Mhm.
So there's nothing wrong to saying we're scared, we're this, but then pointing out some of the good things in terms of family support and other things. Also, depending on the age of the child, how do we actively involve them? Should kids write notes to President-elect Trump even, saying, I hope you do this or this? There are people you can write to, because that gives them a greater sense of empowerment and not a loss, of control. So
Mhm.
there are things. The issue of, seeing people bullied, to even help kids to think about ways that they can be helpful, and if like that segment I saw, I hope a lot of them saw that motorcycle group who came in when the kid was being bullied, or the whole family, things were being thrown in their lawn. So examples of that, and being able to say in a realistic way, and never denying a child's feeling, but being able to say in a realistic way, there are a lot of very good people in this world.
Yeah.
And one article I read even saying that there are a lot of people who President-elect Trump, people who really do care, and hopefully he cares much more than as President Obama said. What you say during the election and what a candidacy and what you're going to do or say when you're actually president may vary a great deal. And I know, we have to be hopeful in that regard. So I
Yeah.
think we have to look at, first of all, are we presenting a very honest picture as adults that we have different feelings, but we also presenting a way of coping, at looking at things and being realistically hopeful with kids. And we should never minimize or deny a child's problems. It's like the old thing, boys don't cry, whatever. No, we have those feelings and kids are going to see it. So it's better to acknowledge it, but then really to serve as models of coping with kids. And the more we can involve them, as I said before, in some activity that helps them to feel more in, a sense of that they are doing something, I think the less stressed they're going to be.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so I want to add to that. Not that I have my own children, but it's really easy for me to get back into the mindset of the child I was. And I have a lot of sensitivity around that. But I remember, still to this day, one of the worst things someone can say to me is take a deep breath or just relax or it's not that bad. And you mentioned that earlier, because the only time people say that is when stuff's bad. Like,
I know what
my mom finally gave up. She's like, I'm not going to tell you that nothing bad's going to happen, because every time we'd go, I would have to like, no, are they going to take blood? Are they going to do this? Are they going to do that? And the one time she would say no, they would. So it
Oh
was,
yeah.
you know, but I think that is so important, that not to minimize what the child is experiencing, but also to be so aware of the non-conscious cues you're sending in your own stress management. And I just did a presentation on trying to help caregivers who are dealing with Alzheimer's and dementia
Mhm.
patients. The same thing, when someone's really struggling, there's only so much that you can do. But one of those things is how you show up and the energy you bring to that space, because we may put on a fake smile, or we may be sensing something as often that is so highly contagious to the other person. I find it fascinating that the electromagnetic field of the heart can extend 3 to 5 feet beyond our body. So when you're like freaking out,
I didn't know that.
so,
That's right.
it's so contagious. I talk a lot about secondhand stress for that reason, because people don't realize that, leaders in companies come in and say everything's fine. And when the employee knows at a gut level things aren't
Oh
okay,
yeah.
ooh,
Yeah.
that just
What
rubs.
you bring up is so vital. I always say to people how we have to validate another person's feelings. Validation doesn't mean you agree or whatever. It means
Right.
you validate. And sometimes even loving parents, the kid is distressed or whatever, and they say, don't be. But I remember one of my talks, a mother said, every night my son says that he's ugly and stupid. And I said to the mother, it was very painful. I said to the mother, well, what do you say? And she said, well, you're not. And I said, well, how does your son respond? She said, that's what I don't understand. He seems to get more upset.
Yeah.
And I said, you know what? And this was a true story. When I was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Colorado Medical School, I had a 9-year-old, just like her son, who said, I'm ugly and stupid. And I thought I was being a good therapist. I said, oh, no, you're not. And I love these 9-year-old philosophers. He looked at me and he just like this, he said, do you listen to people? And what he meant was, he's telling me he's dumb and stupid. And so the mother said, oh, I should agree with my son. I said, no, validate it. Say, I'm glad you could tell me. I know that's not easy and whatever. And if the kid's in therapy with me, I used to say to the parents, and then say, that's why you're seeing Dr. Brooks. He could be of help.
Yeah. And
We,
to appreciate the difficulty of, regardless of whether it's true or not, to feel that way must be really hard. I
yeah,
remember one of the best kind of verifying moments, validating moments with my dad. I had a significant weight problem growing up, and it wasn't anything too crazy, but it was always denied. No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't. And it was funny, but later on in life, my dad sat with me, and he had looked at some old pictures, and he said, I just want to let you know I never really understood, because you're my daughter and you're perfect in my eyes.
oh,
And
wow.
so it's appreciating to hear that, or hear that
Yeah,
feedback. You're not stupid, or you're not this, but also to be able to appreciate what that experience might be like and feel like. And so how can we help you to not feel that way? Because
exactly.
for a parent to say, you're perfect is helpful, but maybe not the best answer.
Especially, I know, I say, look, I start with the assumption we're all well-intentioned, but sometimes if you're not feeling perfect and you realize that words are being said, that people are trying to reassure you, but you don't feel that, I think it's much more comforting actually for people to say, I can see you're sad, or I can see you're this or whatever. And then say, we have to figure out what will be helpful, as a therapist. So I learned my lesson from that 9-year-old boy when he said, do you listen to people? And I was just trying to be reassuring, but he was right. I wasn't really listening. He was telling me about his pain, and I was telling him it shouldn't be there. That's how he heard it. And I was saying it because I wanted to be somewhat comforting to him as a caring therapist. I learned you could caring therapist validates what the other person is experiencing and feeling, but that's part of
And
our own
such a
progress.
gift that parents can give, because I think our tendency is to want to fix it. Uh,
Exactly.
and that's not wrong. It's just, if we can have the awareness that that's our tendency, and then also just know that in those moments, a lot of times what we need to do is just be present and just hear and appreciate someone's experience.
Yes, sometimes just as a therapist being there, I always have worse things to say, but just being there was very important. And some parents, unfortunately, in today's world, almost go overboard. They just they're just, the best thing I could say is they so want to protect their kids that their kids don't develop any resources to handle stress. Parents rushing in. That's a whole other topic.
Oh my gosh, I know. And that was one of the things I wrote down. So, what I'm taking from this and what I want to share, and I'll do a short post on this, is really what I hear you saying is that what parents can do is to instill confidence in how they kind of show up in their energy, that they can help kids to have a feeling of control by getting involved in doing something. And then also those coping mechanisms. I think that that's one of our greatest faults just as a society is we don't teach kids how to cope, that stress is inevitable and things are going to happen where we're not in control, and we're not teaching them those skills. So are there a couple of specific coping strategies that you tend to turn to?
Me, myself, or as a psychologist?
Either way.
Well, I always find, over the years, exercise has always been important to me.
Yeah.
I try to exercise every day. I also like to just, sometimes when I'm feeling a little tense, just to relax for a few minutes, get away from the computer, the things we say. I try, although I know that I exercise so I can eat once in a while a nice cookie or something, I do try to watch what I eat. And, other people have written about this. I also remind myself, the things I'm grateful for, that I've been very blessed in my life. I had, a wonderful family, and had two parents, both of whom were immigrants and gave quite a bit. They didn't lead the easiest lives, but when they came to the country, what they gave to all of us were, very important. So you look at that and you say, when you see all that's going on in the world, that is, very fortunate, and just the connections I have with my family and friends today. So, sometimes it's important to remind ourselves, again, not to deny what's going on, but to realize you have, there's a big support system. And when you mentioned isolation, over the years, I used to think of it more sometimes with kids, teenagers feeling isolated. But then I listened to my adult patients, and you'd see isolation is really, and loneliness is just so powerful. And, in my book about resilience in adults, some of the studies I looked at, it's a major health issue. And we have to recognize it as such. And it even changed the way I started interviewing my adult patients, asking them not how many friends they have, but who do they turn to. Yeah. And just one quick point, when I was looking at the research on resilience, and people were interviewed who had really managed some very difficult times, and they were asked, what do you think you were able to do? And the first answer almost invariably was there was at least one person who believed in me and stood by me. And, my talks, I mentioned that psychologist, he died a few years ago, Julius Siegel in Washington. He called that person a charismatic adult. Some people weren't thrilled by the word charismatic, but his definition for me was poetic. It's an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. But then I expanded it to say, even as adults, we need those adults in our lives.
So true.
And it doesn't mean 30 of them, even one or two, can play a major role when we're having difficulties. And so even in my clinical practice, I started asking people, who do they turn to? And sadly, some really did not have anyone they were turning to.
Yeah. I spent many years of my life that way, and understand that you can be surrounded by thousands of people and still feel really isolated. In fact, more so when you're surrounded by that many people, I think. And it's been dramatic to see what has happened now. I think sometimes doing more with less, because we think we need volume, and it's really about depth.
Yes. I have 2 or 3 very close friends who I could share anything with. And then there are acquaintances who I like being with, but there are those who, and some family members that, including my wife, that is very, that just very, very important to have. As a matter of fact, when we were just talking about what you just said, I remember when my wife was out shopping when 9/11 occurred, when the news was on, and when she came back, I was crying. I told her what happened, and I remember it was a simple act. She hugged me and said, "No one should cry alone." And, and it's just was very powerful at that moment there, because, all the memories of the phone call when my brother was killed, and they all come up. in that regard. So that, and what you described, whether it's at a bar or not, you may never see these people again. But the strong connections that we need at those times are so powerful. And it's interesting as we're talking, just, it reminds me of how questions I ask patients changed, how things I brought up in my workshops really started to change more. I have this wonderful quote from Dr. Dean Ornish, who's done so much on cardiovascular illness, but he has this great quote where he says something like, I'm paraphrasing it, if there was a medication for loneliness and we didn't prescribe it, it would be malpractice. And because he said loneliness is one of the most powerful detriments to our health. And I include that in almost all my workshops now. It may have been in the workshop in Boston when I didn't show any of the PowerPoints because the screen went blank. But it is, that importance of connections is really, to me, the bottom line. That's why I tell teachers, your first job is to create an environment where kids want to learn. And as therapists, well, we know the relationship is important, and in almost anything we do in life, those relationships are really, for me, the nourishment by which resilience can grow.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's a beautiful way to end, and just encouraging anybody that might be watching this to know that there is choice and personal control in connecting with people, and to not underestimate how deeply you can affect someone's life. It reminds me of the movie Pay It Forward. And I think sometimes we think that things are so simple that we should really complicate it and make it, it's really not. You don't know how a simple smile or conversation can affect people. And a funny story about that, my boyfriend and I frequent Chipotle down the street, and we go there so often. It's become a little bit like family, but last night was the first time I actually had 3 different servers in that restaurant hug me. And it was just, it took me aback to think about the impact that you have when you show up in a space with love and joy and appreciation and have those conversations, and you don't know what that person might be experiencing or dealing with. But just this simple bringing that positive energy of gratitude and appreciation to each person can, I think, change our culture, change our environment.
Right. And we have to think of how whatever's going on, that little step of someone hugging you or you hugging them, it starts within us in one way. And how we speak to people, how we speak to service. We have a restaurant not far from where we live, and I always think of it as Cheers, where everybody knows your name. And it's like that. And the owners at this point, my wife and I go there, they give us a hug when we leave, but it's like all the tables almost seem to join in discussions. It's a small little restaurant, but I always enjoy going there.
Yeah, and so be open to that. You just never know where you're going to see those, have those experiences.
I know.
Wonderful. So I have one last question I want to ask. Because I just find myself so curious about this. Stress is such a funny word. We use it to kind of capture all that is wrong. It's the only word I know of that, in addition to being itself, is the cause of itself and the result of itself. I think the only one I can think of is love is the other one, which is kind of ironic. How do you personally define stress?
I'm not
There's
sure
even a need to define it, but
yeah, you know what? It's very interesting you say that, because, when I was in graduate school, they talked about eustress and distress and whatever. And now with all the research coming out, so I know I use it loosely, like, without even thinking of all the physiology and brain, what's going on in the brain, really, that if things are getting, well, this is going to sound very scientific, Heidi, things are getting stirred up or whatever. And certainly I feel it in my body. I would say that, we all feel it very differently. I sometimes feel a little, I shouldn't say a little, but some tension forming in my body. That's why I certainly like to exercise, because I feel that very helpful to me. The stress, why I'm smiling, when I see people, the stress with patients it starts really as, as Goldman said, an emotional hijacking the amygdala time. that their thinking is not as clear, their problem solving is not as clear. But then I back up and say, well, wait a second. A little stress sometimes gets you to think more about problems. So I almost view it as a continuum that some stress, if we, however we want to define it. You see how I've avoided the question. However we want to define it, prompts us into action. Like that's why I started thinking about, with the election results, which totally surprised me. I was very stressed out. I think, but okay, what could I do? And I said, one thing I know I'm going to do, I'm going to write an article about it because maybe I could, be helpful in that way. What else? I made sure I exercised, that day. And by the way, without the television being on, because I knew what I was going to see the results, on that. So I almost view it as this continuum that something is, certainly getting activated in our bodies. It's a certain signal, but for me, how far it goes, does it become disabling, or does it help us to really, find ways of coping, with it? And so I'm not, from with all that you've done, you have a better understanding. I didn't know that about the heart and things like this. And I always admire people like yourself who actually know what's going on, in one's body in that regard.
Well, it's just a different lens. So, I think it's part of why I ask. I think I'm working on a book called What's So Funny About Stress. And part of what I find so funny about stress is it's almost impossible to define, but we talk about it all the time. And so, even as resilience experts kind of helping people cope with stress, there's all these different elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what's a fun place to, a fun space to play in for me is having the discussion and seeing if we can define it a little bit more clearly, because I think it will actually help people manage it more effectively if they know what they're dealing with, even if it's the dichotomy of the fact that it's just energy, it's just information.
Yeah. Oh, what you're saying is critical because one psychologist was famous for reframing things. So the words we use to define it is something, but you're right. The more you could define it, then the more you have more control over it and the more you can find ways of coping. So when you put out this definitive book of yours,
I'm not sure yet if it's going to be a comedy or a research book, so we'll see where.
Knowing you, I hope it's both. But yeah, and just let me say, we're talking about relations. I am so glad you came into my life. I really am, because you're just so delightful.
Thank you, and I feel the same. And I was going to say, you're one of those charismatic adults. I'll call you an adult and not myself, but it is the work that we're collectively doing, I think, is really important. And the energy and how you show up and your ability to bring humor to that space has just been delightful. So to me, this is just the start of a conversation. It's just chapter one.
I view it, maybe just a preface. I know I view it that way. You are just really delightful. I feel like I could sit and talk with you for hours and hours. So I hope we'll have an opportunity.
We will, and I will invite you back to speak more about this very, very soon if the offer is open.
Always.